In the pre-dawn cold of December 17, 1944, a Tiger's engine coughed once, twice, and died. The great steel heart of the vehicle, the machine that made men call it the Beast and made entire infantry units give it a lane, fell silent on a frost-crusted road. The commander slammed the hatch, spat curse and breath into the air, and listened to a world reduced to scraping tracks and distant sentries. Not a shell had cracked their armor, not a mine had stopped the sprockets. The reason the tank would not move was small, humiliating, and utterly mundane. It had no fuel. For men who had been told that fuel would be the prize to crown their gamble, the sight was an insult. They had crossed forests and bottlenecks, believing that a captured truck park or a seized depot would change everything. A long push through the Ardennes, they were told, would deliver the supplies that would keep their armored spearheads roaring. Instead, here at the edge of the village, the Tiger slumped on its belly, a monument to arithmetic. It was into this cold, into this sudden stillness, that the column's regimental commander, identified in later interviews as Piper, walked with cautious curiosity. Ahead, in a clearing lit by the ghosts of early lamps and the glow of smear-gray sky, something that should, by any sensible account, have been treasure, lay stacked in orderly rows. Jerry cans, thousands of them, arranged as if on parade. They were stacked 3, sometimes 4 deep, forming low walls beside overturned crates, an ordinary civilian geometry made strange by the setting and the expectations it had aroused. For a moment the men laughed. Relief broke across faces stiff from winter and worry. Here, finally, was what they had been promised. Gasoline, the oil of mechanized war, fuel that could feed engines and dreams alike. Men ran forward with canteens and spanners, ripping caps, sloshing the sweet, poisonous smell of benzene, pressing mouths to spouts into the grates of tanks. Papers and manifests fluttered out when someone pried open a crate. Numbers were read aloud, half believed. It was to them a kind of providence, a cache of fuel that might give them hours, maybe days of movement. They were wrong to celebrate. What looked like salvation to a troop in the mud was, in strategic terms, nothing more than an accounting footnote. If we step back from the men and the cans to the map and the ledger, the story changes. The American logistical system in late 1944 was not a collection of fortuitous depots. It was a sewn thing: pipelines, refineries, convoys, airlift, a machine that stitched supplies into a front that stretched from Normandy to the Ardennes. PLUT pipes from the beaches to the continent. The Red Ball Express ran day and night in columns of dusty, smoke-darkened trucks. Air supply could parachute petrol to places where roads choked.
American refineries and industrial plants, fed by global sources of crude and a mobilized economy, produced petroleum on a scale that dwarfed German synthetic output. To the men before the jerry cans, a captured depot felt immense. To the planners in rear echelon offices, it was a drop in a very large ocean. This is where the sewing machine picture matters. The term is a metaphor, deliberately so. There was no literal device with needles and gears named for it. What the Allies had built, intentionally, methodically, and at scale, was a logistical apparatus that sewed fuel, tires, ammunition, and personnel into place across 1,000 miles of war. Pipelines threaded under surf and soil, truck routes stitched towns together, repair shops mended ragged edges, and, when necessary, airfields, tankers, and command decisions would unpick a thread rather than let it be woven into an enemy's garment. The Germans could capture a pocket of supply. They could not, with their limited synthetic production and fractured fuel economy, replace what the Allies could throw away. Throw away is a blunt verb, but it stages the theater of December. The American logistician's calculus was simple. Better 1 million gallons of petrol burned in the open than 1 million gallons added to an enemy's strategic advantage. When the Americans controlled the communication lines to that depot and feared they could not hold the surrounding ground, they chose denial. Engineers poured kerosene and ignited charges. Night became a column of flame. The sky turned black with smoke. The spectacle was, for those who watched it from a distance, almost apocalyptic. For the Germans who had dreamed of fuel to feed their push, it was decisive. There is an irony here that the men at the jerry cans felt in their bones only later. At first, the stacks looked like salvation because they had no sense of the scale in which the other side operated.
They saw a visible mound of metal and liquid and equated it with strategic parity. They did not know how many miles of pipe, refinery turnstiles, and truck drivers stood between that stack and an enemy's 100,000-ton logistic reserve. They had not seen yet the toll that traffic jams, poor weather, and misread directives would take on their own columns. Hours and gallons evaporated in stalled engines and idle radios. Small choices on the ground became arithmetic. When a column ran into a blown bridge or a skirmish that demanded artillery to clear a lane, vehicles idled. Engines turn fuel into heat even when a vehicle is merely moving from a road to a field. Idling consumes resources. The Germans had planned for a certain consumption curve, tanks moving at pace, fuel arriving at precise intervals. That was an arithmetic based on confidence that the strategic logistics network could be rotated in threads to fit. But plans meet terrain, weather, and enemy action. The Ardennes in December is a place that rearranges schedules.
The narrow roads choked with vehicles. The trees offered cover and ambush. The more the column jammed, the more fuel it squandered, and the thinner the string between ambition and reality became. We returned to Piper and his men. A sergeant climbed a pile of cans and, for the cameras of memory, read out manifest numbers. He told of jerry cans stacked shoulder high, of labels and dates, of crates with the stamps of American depots from weeks earlier. His voice, later, carried the astonishment of men who had been taught to measure success by captured wagons, but who did not yet grasp the arithmetic that made those wagons inconsequential. We thought, he said in a post-war interview, that once we had a little petrol, everything would be different. That simple sentence holds the center of the mistake: confusion between localized plenty and systemic abundance. To understand why that confusion mattered, we have to take a breath and look at numbers and systems without romance. The United States, by virtue of geography, industrial base, and access to global crude, produced petroleum in volumes that were staggering compared to Germany's synthetic gasoline program. The Americans could transform raw material into motive power at a tempo Germany could not match. Factories did not only assemble tanks and planes, they produced the lubricants and the fuel those machines needed. Tankers crossed oceans, ports turned over cargo, rail yards chopped and fed. Droves of drivers on the Red Ball Express ferried gasoline and rations in a choreography that, to the frontline soldier, must have looked like magic. To an operator, it was logistics. This reality produced strange behavior in the field. Where the German commander feared scarcity and hoarded, the American could afford redundancy and sometimes waste. Where the German officer dreamed of salvaging a depot, the American engineer burned it rather than let it become a prop for a desperate offensive. It was not cruelty, it was cost accounting at the scale of nation-states. A tanker lost to flame was a ledger entry. A taste of fuel in an enemy belly was the difference between a pause and a breakthrough. We can make this concrete by tracing one of the decisions that would define the Ardennes in those days. In a small town, recorded in dispatches and interviews under varying names, Stavelot and the area around Le Glaise feature in most reliable maps. Some field reports reference a depot near Hansfeld, indefinido. American logistics officers received word that German columns were approaching the area where a large fuel dump sat. The dump had been built to support mobile operations and was for a time secure. Rows of drums and crates, flammable and fragrant, stacked as if in a farmer's lot. It symbolized mobility. It symbolized power. The decision to destroy it was not made by a field sergeant in the dark. It proceeded through a chain of command that reflected doctrine. Engineers were called. Charges were prepared. Men who had been loading trucks and scrambling supplies were turned to a different task: deny the enemy. They poured accelerant along rows, set incendiary charges, and, as the lights went out and the night closed, they hurled a match into what would become a towering pillar of black flame. An eyewitness, who later spoke with historians, Technical Sergeant Paul Salas, described the ignition not as triumph, but as necessity, a bitter arithmetic. We do not need melodrama to see the effect. The night sky over the depot turned black with smoke that rose like a column 1,000 feet high. The glare was visible for miles. Engines killed their appetite in a single blaze. The Germans, who had watched cheerfully as their men filled cans, found instead a night of fire that fed only the wind. The depot's destruction removed the small hope that a captured fuel pile might rescue a stalled advance. It also delivered a message: the enemy could afford to burn that which Germany could not afford to replace.
There is a moral and a practical point hidden in that darkness. When we speak of the Battle of the Bulge, our attention, understandably, gathers on tanks, on artillery barrages, on storm-racked infantry. Those are the vivid, human things. But the decisive chessboard was the ledger, and the pieces were barrels and pipelines rather than crowns and pawns. The German planners had assumed that an initial break could be turned into a strategic success if they could punch through and seize Allied ports or fuel dumps. That assumption did not take full account of Allied capacity to disperse, conceal, and crucially, to deny. The American logistical model was resilient by redundancy. The Red Ball Express, for example, was not a glamorous operation. It was hundreds of trucks and equally enormous numbers of maintenance crews, refuelers, and dispatchers moving tons of petrol every day across the ration of Europe. It was not poetry. It was muscle memory and paperwork. When those trucks stalled, mechanics fixed them. When a cold snap clung to roads, drivers rerouted. When a depot might fall, commanders preferred to light a match than to let an adversary benefit. Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, though still associated more with the Normandy breakout earlier in 1944, and other infrastructure meant that the United States could keep replenishing what was burned without a proportional hit to frontline capability. This was the strategic asymmetry that the German offensive could not erase. Imagine two economies of force, one built on conservatism and synthetic scarcity, the other on expansive input. The defenders could afford to waste some measure of supply. The attackers could not. The result was not instantaneous defeat for German arms, but it made successful exploitation of tactical gains unlikely. A spearhead that could not be refueled would simply become a stunning, immobile prize.
Back with Piper, the realization of that arithmetic was slow and bitter. He had wanted a tactical victory that might translate into operational momentum. Instead, he watched his men trade a momentary bonfire of joy for the grim spectacle of distant flames that consumed what they believed belonged to them. The psychological crest that the Germans had hoped to ride, a captured fuel dump leading to extended mobility, collapsed into a trough. Men who had expected to scream forward now had to reconceive their timetable, their goals trimmed by fuel gauges rather than audacity. A number of small human episodes illuminate what otherwise might read as merely sterile logistics. One soldier, later interviewed, described a comrade who emptied his can and then, hands trembling, climbed onto the mudguard of a tank to peer into the engine. The engine coughed and the man's face went white. There was only an oil smear left, no motion. Another recounting tells of a lieutenant who, with a map and a pipe dream, tried to reroute his division along a narrower road to save time and fuel, only to find a column of vehicles waiting ahead, a long snake of stalled motors that ate hours of gasoline. Every delay had an arithmetic consequence. The engine that idled in a ditch was fuel gone from a future attack. Not all of this unfolded in the cold with dramatic scenes of fire. Many of the decisive moments were bureaucratic, analytical, and pedestrian. The logistician who recalculated tonnage and found the plan unworkable. The depot clerk who wrote down manifests and realized the numbers owed more to hope than reality. The radio operator who relayed a change of plan and watched the convoy reverse course. These were not lesser roles. In the calculus of operational possibility, they were the sinews. We should be careful here not to reduce human courage or battlefield skill to the thinness of an oil drum. Men fought bravely on both sides. The Germans mounted assaults with skill and desperation. Allied troops, too, dug foxholes, manned anti-tank guns, and held ground at personal cost. But courage without fuel is like a ship without wind, a tragic, noble drift. The narrative truth is that by December 1944, modern mechanized war had become in large measure an industrial contest. Whoever could maintain the flow of fuel, parts, and repair had a disproportionate advantage. That is not to say that every battle was predetermined by production figures alone. Weather, command decisions, and chance still mattered. But when you run the numbers, and when you stand beside a tank with a dry tank and a man's breath frosting in front of you, a pattern emerges. This pattern explains why the American commanders, even when faced with the sight of an enemy hungry for their fuel, sometimes chose public destruction. It was an ugly calculus: deny the opponent, protect the strategic flow. It also explains the German astonishment in the days following the depot burns.
Men who had thought themselves rescuable by a cache of captured petrol found their hopes consumed by a smoky pyre. If the story so far reads like a parable about scale and denial, that is because it is. The technical terms, Pluto, Red Ball Express, tanker production are the anatomy of the sewing machine. The needles are pipelines and convoys. The thread is the fuel and supplies that tie the front together. The Allies had seamed their logistical fabric tightly enough that for every pocket of captured supply the Germans might seize, there were dozens of other threads that could be cut, rerouted, or replaced without threatening the whole garment. And yet, the sewing machine metaphor goes further. A sewing machine can make garments. It can also, when turned deliberately, unmake them. By burning a depot, by denying a captured stock, the logistical apparatus did more than withhold benefit. It actively prevented the enemy from turning local gains into operational advantage. That intentional unpicking was a strategic act as much as an act of supply. It required command authority, engineering skill, and a willingness to accept immediate loss for a broader systemic good. Piper's column moved on, the Tiger still immobile, the jerry cans half empty in the confusion. Word spread slowly through the ranks of what had happened down the road, of the depot turned into a bonfire, of the American decision to sacrifice 1,000,000 gallons rather than risk a breakthrough. Rumors amplified the psychological effect. The enemy could burn, the enemy could replace, the enemy could laugh at what Germany could not reproduce. For men already fighting on narrowed fuel budgets, that laughter felt like salt. We must pause to name, clearly and dispassionately, what this meant for the operational horizon of the offensive. Tanks without fuel could not exploit gaps. Infantry without supporting motors could not shift their axes of attack. Artillery that could not be moved could not be emplaced where they were needed. The German plan for a quick, sharp thrust hinged on seizing logistical points and turning them to their advantage. When those points were turned instead into spectacles of denial, the plan's tempo decayed. Momentum is not only a physical concept. In war, it is also a temporal one. The longer an army takes to exploit a breach, the more opportunities the opponent has to close it. The lack of fuel lengthened every pause. So far, we have focused on the human scenes and the arithmetic that undercut them, but to understand why the Allied system could both supply and, when necessary, destroy, we must look at the enabling capacity, industry, refineries in the United States, tanker fleets, pipeline engineers, and a domestic system of supply combined to produce a velocity of logistics seldom seen in prior wars. Factories turned out engines and the fuel to run them. Rail yards moved that fuel, ports and pipelines distributed.
The German synthetic plants could not approach the volume or the redundancy. That is the essential asymmetry. At the level of human experience, it was manifest in small humiliations. A driver who could not top off his tank, a unit that had to abandon a half-functioning vehicle because hauling it cost more fuel than leaving it and extracting the crew. In all these moments, supply dictated options. The operational malleability of the Allied side was greater because its inputs were larger and more fungible. On the German side, every gallon saved was a strategic asset hoarded because it could not be readily replaced. And yet there was still room for tactical flair, for local surprise, for acts of bravery that rearranged moments. The Ardennes saw both. But those moments could not be scaled without fuel. That is what the night of the burning depot taught many who watched. A local triumph of capture could be countered by systemic capacity to deny and replace. The Allies did not have to win every engagement by superior arms. In many cases, they simply ensured that their logistic fabric remained intact while absorbing, and when necessary, sacrificing fragments. As dawn stretched and fingers of gray light crept over stone and frozen puddle, Piper walked back to his column. The Tiger remained a hulking emblem of what the offensive was supposed to be. Around it, men argued, cleaned, and planned, as if the problem could be fixed by will alone. Some thought to strip the jerry cans of their steel and fashion a makeshift feed. Others suggested a change of axis, a reroute that might find fuel elsewhere. Each option required time and gallons, and increasingly, the improbable, that the enemy would not notice and act to deny. By the time the first order to withdraw a segment of the column came down hours later, the tone of the day had shifted. The initial laughter had become a muffled resignation. The men had counted and found themselves wanting. The map, once bright with arrows, had lost some of its aggressive color. The sewing machine, silent to cold eyes that had seen only cans, had revealed itself as a mechanism the enemy could both employ and, if necessary, wield against them. The question that would linger in the days to come was not whether brave men could fight. It was whether a nation could produce and sustain the material flows that made movement meaningful. The next hours were to be filled with traffic jams, last-minute orders, and small acts of improvisation that could not substitute for a strategic shortfall. The engines that sputtered and fell silent in the Ardennes were not mere machines. They were the metronomes of possibility. When they stopped, what stopped was not only a vehicle, but the timetable of ambition. By mid-morning, the column had lost whatever invisible thread had once bound its ambition.
Roads that had seemed merely congested in the blue light before dawn were now solid ribbons of men and metal.
Trucks coughed. Half a dozen Stoogs lay to the roadside like wounded animals. A king tiger with its turret canted at an angle had been abandoned with its tracks frozen to a rut. The cold made metal brittle and patience thinner. Drivers climbed out, stamped their boots, and stared at dials with the same small private disbelief. The gauges read empty more often than not. A lieutenant barked orders to shift a flank. A sergeant went to fetch spare hose and a can that might fit a German coupling. A corporal argued with a map. There were alternative routes, yes, but they were longer. Longer routes meant more miles of road, and more miles of road meant more fuel. Each decision chewed away at the margin the campaign had built into its plan. When a man at the head of a column cut his engine to inspect a bridge, that single pause took from the overall pool of fuel the amount his engine would have used during 10 minutes of steady rolling. Multiply that by a host of small interruptions, traffic control, broken down vehicles, men shifting positions, and the arithmetic becomes cruelly simple. If the Germans had been counting on captured supplies to repair their calculus, the day's events taught a sharper lesson. Visibility is not supply. Seeing thousands of jerry cans stacked in a clearing gives the impression of plenty because it satisfies the eye. Supply is not what sits exposed on a field, it is what can be moved, stored, refined, and protected at scale. Behind every stack of metal was an invisible, complex arrangement. Rail spurs, fuel trains, refinery schedules, drivers who knew the roads by the hours they had spent on them. Those arrangements belong not to the front, but to the hinterlands, the set of systems that make the front mobile. There was a practical reckoning that could not be escaped. Orders came down, sometimes chaotic, sometimes crisp, from rear commands who had to decide with imperfect information whether to attempt to hold a dump or to burn it. The doctrine was clear. If denial preserved the integrity of a broader flow, deny. It was a calculus made in offices and on telephone wires, not in the mud of the road. Field engineers like Technical Sergeant Paul Sullis were the hands that turned that calculus into action. Sullis's testimony, given in a post-war interview, reads like a technician's journal of necessity. He described men trained to keep fuel moving, being asked in a few bitter hours to see it immolorate. They laid lines of accelerant, threaded detonating ribbon along rows of drums, and lit the first charges with steady hands. We had to turn it into a firestorm, he recalled. It felt wrong to watch gasoline go up like that, but the order was simple. If they might take it and use it to break through, it had to go. His voice carried the weary cadence of someone who had spent his war feeding engines and then spent a night feeding a blaze. The flames leapt higher than anyone expected.
Weather and wind played their part. A gust could hurl sparks into nearby hedgerows. Another could spread the smoke like a curtain across the valley. The glow painted the faces of troops on both sides a cruel orange. Captain John Brewster, an engineer officer charged with coordinating demolition and denial in the sector, later explained how the decision was reached. Messages crackled through command nets. German columns reported near. Reconnaissance confirmed movement toward the depot. The choice was presented bluntly. Try to hold and risk the enemy seizing intact fuel, or destroy and accept an immediate local loss to preserve the strategic advantage. Brewster's account is not dramaturgic, it is procedural. He recalls meeting with battalion leaders under a lean-to, showing them maps and overlays, and then signaling the engineers. "We had no illusions," he said. "We knew what burning would mean for the men who might need fuel soon, but the alternative, letting them take 1,000,000 gallons that would turn an assault into a pursuit, was worse." Brewster spoke of the technicalities, fuse lengths, a calculated ring of fire to ensure nothing remained salvageable, and soldiers with torches walking away while flame leapt up in arcs. The sight that followed acquired, in the memory of many who watched it from both sides, an almost emblematic quality. The fire did more than destroy barrels of fuel. It announced a strategic truth in a way numbers alone cannot. From miles around, smoke rose in a black column that seemed to map the difference between two national capacities, the ability to create mobility and the inability to replace it. For a German soldier who had spent months rationing, who had learned to treat a jerry can as currency, the flames read like an insult. For the Allied logistician who had organized convoys and pipelines, it was a painful but necessary arithmetic. There is an irony that deserves emphasis. The Germans had hoped that a startling capture, rows of enemy fuel, would make immediate tactical breakthroughs possible and would alter the tempo of the offensive. The Allies had designed their logistics to be robust enough to sustain tactical shocks and resilient enough to accept losses. To do this, they overbuilt. Pluto and other pipeline efforts were part of that resilience, a way to get fuel from the beachhead into the continent without relying exclusively on vulnerable surface shipping. The Red Ball Express was another layer, a massive truck operation that moved gasoline, rations, engines, and ammunition across the newly liberated highways. It was not graceful, it was methodical, repetitive, and above all, abundant.
These were the elements of the sewing machine metaphor made practical, a multiplicity of threads running so many routes that cutting a few did not unmake the whole. Piper's reaction to the night's fire was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, accumulating realization, the way frost creeps across a pane.
At first, he had felt relief at the sight of metal in cans. He had believed in doctrines of capture and exploitation. If you seize enough of your enemy's supplies, your momentum can change. But standing under that smoke, watching the enemy deliberately destroy the very thing his men had thought would save them, he began to work through a new arithmetic. What the Allies destroyed, they could replace. What his forces might capture, they could not refabricate in meaningful numbers. That arithmetic had strategic consequences that would show themselves across the coming days. A company ordered to press an advantage found its tanks listed as immobile in the morning reports because they had consumed fuel in attempts to extricate bogged vehicles. Another unit, ordered to pursue a retreating foe, delayed to jerry-rig a hose for a German coupling. Time lost translated to fuel lost, and fuel lost translated to options foreclosed. When commanders farther back tried to recoup momentum with fresh orders, they were stymied by the same blunt facts. Distances on the map do not vanish because a general wants them to, and distances cost fuel. It is tempting and historically facile to compress this into simple formulas. Production plus pipelines equals victory. The truth requires a more nuanced expression. Logistics is not merely a supply line, it is a set of choices about distribution, dispersion, redundancy, and, crucially, doctoring. The Allies did not always use their abundance wisely. They made errors, wasted convoys, and sometimes misallocated shipments. But their industrial base offered them latitude. Germany's synthetic program, which attempted to convert coal into liquid fuels, required plants, specialized technicians, and a supply of coal subject to its own vulnerabilities. Those plants were strategic targets and could be interdicted. They could not be sustained indefinitely under bombardment and blockade. The result was an operational asymmetry. The Allies could afford to maintain a margin. Germany could not. We see that asymmetry in small human moments that together form a pattern. A maintenance crew in an American depot broke into laughter when an entire truck, its cargo jerry cans, was ordered burned. For them, the order to burn wrote off a unit cost that mattered on a ledger. For a German reconnaissance group that had been shadowing convoys, that laughter sounded like contempt. They took the moment personally because, on paper, 1 million gallons was both a resource and a symbol of what their nation could no longer produce in equal measure. On the perimeter, the fighting did not always pause for these grand considerations. Small engagements continued, patrols clashed around farmsteads, anti-tank guns barked, and men were cut down in the frost. But each of those actions was now occurring under the constraint of fuel.
Artillery emplacements that required tractors were delayed or left behind. Anti-aircraft guns that could not be shifted became fixed targets. The cumulative effect was operational attrition that fell more heavily on the attacker. There were other, less visible ways in which logistics shaped morale. Word runs through an army the way a rumor runs through a village, unevenly and with distortion. In the days after the depot fires, German soldiers traded stories. How the enemy had burned their prize, how the enemy could replace it with untroubled industry, how their own headquarters had promised much and delivered little. A private who had expected to guard a captured depot for a heroic week found himself sleeping beside a hulk of metal whose engine would never turn again. A platoon leader who had calculated his attack on the basis of a timetable learned that when he asked his superiors for extra fuel, the allocation system had already been committed to another sector. These were not merely logistical failures, they were the soft tissues of morale fraying under strategic pressure. It is worth pausing to consider the language we use. The term sewing machine in the title is deliberately metaphorical. There was no literal machine with that name manipulating supply across the theater, but the metaphor captures something crucial, a complex interlocking set of processes that knit together production, transit, and distribution into a functioning front. Pipelines were the needles, convoys and airlifts were the threat, depots and repair yards were the thimbles protecting the fabric. The Allied sewing machine was both constructive and destructive. It stitched men and material into place. When required, it also unstitched a local gain before an enemy could transform it into a decisive advantage.
From a strategic point of view, the decision to destroy fuel was one of several vectors that made the Ardennes offensive unsustainable. It did not single-handedly doom the operation. Weather, the resilience of Allied defenses, intelligence gaps, and the sheer difficulties of moving men and armor through winter woods all played essential parts, but denying fuel amplified those other problems. A breakthrough that cannot be exploited because vehicles cannot move is for all intents and purposes a broken promise. We can make this idea more concrete by looking at how Allied logistical networks absorbed the cost of destruction and continued to function. Even as depots burned, convoys rerouted, trucks that might otherwise have paused were redirected. PLUTO and the Continental pipelines fed refineries and dumps further to the rear. Port operations shifted to compensate for local losses. The redundancy of the system, that is, its ability to route around damage, meant that the strategic impact of losing single points of supply was limited.
Denial, then, was not only a method of destruction, but a way to preserve a systemic advantage by preventing local reversals from having global effects. That preservation, however, came at human and material costs. Burning fuel meant burning freight and accepting temporary shortages for one's own troops. The calculus required commanders to be brutally pragmatic. For some Allied soldiers on the ground, the sight of flame and smoke was an existential insult. The army they served in had to accept the loss of a resource some of them might soon need. In interviews, several logistics officers expressed melancholy at the necessity. They had spent months making the system work. Now they had to make it kill part of its own output. In the German rear, the impact of these events accumulated into a narrative that undercut morale and credibility. Staff officers who had promised the operational conditions necessary for success found their numbers evaporating on daily reports. A regiment that had expected to advance 40 kilometers in a day now measured progress in stops and starts. Orders that once read like inked confidence now smudged into uncertainty. When the command reflects that its ability to deliver the basic inputs of war is uncertain, tactical risk-taking becomes not an expression of audacity, but a gamble with diminishing odds. As the offensive ground on through its second week, the map grew more austere for the attacker. Villages that might have been occupied for a day became contested for a week. The tempo of operations slowed to fits and starts. German commanders attempted improvisation, reallocating fuel from rear services, cannibalizing trucks for their tanks, issuing ration clarifications, but these measures were stopgaps. Without a sustained input of fuel on the scale the Allies could muster, sustained mobility remained elusive. There is, alongside the arithmetic, a larger lesson about industrial modernity and war. Once mechanization becomes central to how an army fights, the war becomes not merely a contest of tactics, but a contest of supply and replacement. Factories and pipelines are not peripheral, they are part of the fighting force. In December 1944, the Allies' industrial advantage had matured into a strategic weapon. They could replace losses, and importantly, they could deny captured gains. The policy decision to burn fuel, made by people who had a picture of the theater and a ledger of resources, was an operational expression of that weapon. In the final days of the offensive, when exhausted units trickled back and command began to accept the operational reality, there were telltale signs of collapse, except for the stubborn fight found in local pockets. Tanks lay abandoned, stripped of anything that could be reused. Crews walked back toward rear areas, shell-shocked and thin-lipped.
The map of objectives lost its incisive arrows and started to look like a field of small, circumscribed circles, places where fighting had happened, but where no decisive exploitation had occurred. That is how momentum dies, not always with a single catastrophic event, but through 1,000 small adjudications in which the resources to press on never materialize. Piper's last view of the front in that sector was of a landscape littered with stopped machines and quieted engines. He had once believed in the power of a bold push, of seizing the moment, of hand of iron and heart of will. The arithmetic of fuel had taught him something less romantic and more consequential. Strategy is often the discipline of what you can sustain, not merely what you can achieve in a burst of ardor. His men returned, cold and quieter, to positions that would hold for weeks rather than the expected campaign days. The tiger that had died in the pre-dawn frost remained on its belly for the duration, an emblem not of failure of weapons, but of insufficient inputs behind them. We end where the title of this piece begins, the image of the sewing machine. It is both an amplifier and a restraint. The Allied logistical apparatus stitched lines of supply across nations. It kept engines turning, guns firing, and men moving. It was not arrogant in itself, but it allowed commanders the latitude to make hard choices, like burning what might otherwise be captured, to preserve the whole. That choice, made in the smoke of depot fires and in the careful calculations of wartime logistics staffs, helped ensure that the German gamble would not find the seams to tear open the system. This is not to suggest a single-cause narrative. Battles are stormy ensembles of factors. Weather and terrain, intelligence and bravery, command and chance all play parts. But in a mechanized era, one factor grows disproportionately: the capacity to produce and to move what the machines need. In the Ardennes, December 1944, that capacity revealed itself not only in the steady hum of Red Ball convoys and the quiet pumping of pipelines, but in the paradox that the enemy could literally set their own supplies on fire and still keep the broader fabric whole. For the Germans who watched a night sky turned black by flames, the effect was psychological as much as it was material. They saw in the act of destruction a confirmation of an unequal war. The enemy could sacrifice and then replace. The sewing machine could unpick as well as stitch, and that ability was, in a deeply practical sense, a weapon. As the theater settled into the long, carefully managed logistics of counterattack and recovery, abandoned tanks remained as museum pieces of the immediate lesson. They were not only testaments to bravery or to tactical misfortune. They were, more specifically, testaments to an age in which industrial scale on one side made certain operational gambles on the other futile.
If there is a final, sober note to carry away, it is this: commanders must plan with the ledger as well as with the map. Courage and surprise can win engagements. Only supply and production can sustain campaigns. In the Ardennes, a night of fire did not by itself end the war, but it wrote a clear sentence into its operational history. In modern mechanized war, barrels, trucks, pipelines, and the decisions that govern them often decide what the guns alone cannot. If this episode left you wanting to trace those threads more closely, the Red Ball Express, PLUTO, the wartime fuel economy and production figures, there are deep dives that map the technical contours of that logistical sewing machine. For now, stand with those who watch the flames and ask what it tells us about how wars are won and lost, not only on the ridges and in the hedgerows, but in the quiet calculus of supply.